Hi there. Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel thrilled to be here with all these amazing papers, and it's just really exciting. So my talk today focuses on the concept of authenticity in historical and vintage fashion. My current work centers on a dress collection based around appropriated commercial patterns of the interwar period. The design of this collection of women's bifurcated ensembles involves practice-based research into home sewing traditions and material studies of historical artifacts. This fashion collection explores authenticities in the material, culture, and uses of the dress pattern, drawing on themes in art history, media theory, and gender studies. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Great. So, a plethora of dress practices exists around the vernacular wearing of historical clothing. Whether at living history and reenactment events, swing nights, rockabilly dances, or antique car shows, garments transport their wearers to different moments in history. The motivations for collecting and wearing antique and vintage dress are as multifaceted as the fashions themselves, from eco-friendly consumer consciousness, a frustration with fast fashion, to an escapism from the present. Many of the hobbyist historical dress collectors I work with attribute their preoccupation with worn dress to an interest in the traces of the bodies, personal histories, and experiences inscribed in extant garments. Dress historians and curators may welcome the appreciation of antique textile artifacts in popular culture, but they also cringe at botched preservation attempts and the distress caused by wear. In institutional settings, professional concerns must be weighed against the inability of displays based around inanimate mounts to capture the authenticity of dress on the human form. However, the discipline of dress history began with amateur collections and the work of theatrical costumers collecting antique textiles to learn the salient features of construction and style. These practical tool sets enabled them to reproduce authentic historical costumes to be shown and worn on stage. The shift in the status of historical dress from a practical tool to the untouchable archival object for museological collection unravels critical questions and contradictions of authenticity that are the starting points of my work. How does the repurposing from objects of wear to objects of conservation change dress's situation of authenticity when the objects are no longer worn? What authentic attributes does the artifact retain as an object of display? As a representative object, how does a fashion represent history? And how can exhibitions authentically represent fashions when they do not recreate the original moment of display on the human form? My work involves mixing appropriated and fabricated period artifacts and reinterpreting anachronistic aesthetics in popular culture. I will first present an exhibition of mine that illustrates how my work questions the epistemological status of the authentic collection, whether this be in the fashion museum, the art collection, or the wardrobe, and then I'll introduce my thesis project to discuss how my practice-based research process configures and contextualizes an inauthentic interwar dress collection. I am at an early stage of the PhD, so I hope today I'll be able to share my research methods, curatorial approaches, and references to various parts of the literature for studying and exhibiting dress around the question of authenticity with you and get some feedback. So, in 2012, Hendrik Bünke at the Kunsthalle Baden-Baden had asked me to reinterpret the phenomenon of vintage fashion. Over years of collecting in different countries, I had observed the huge shift in vintage consumption with the rise of internet sales platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and eBay, of course, as well as discrepancies in historical fashion reception across national cultures. I wanted to articulate this changing cultural context for the well-heeled visitors to the spa town of Baden-Baden. My Swing Shoe Shop exhibition inscribed narrative traces onto authentic historical artifacts. The shoe is a vessel ready to be filled, a receptacle made for consumer desire. In the former gift shop at the Kunsthalle Baden-Baden, I created a pop-up swing shoe shop using Apple Store aesthetics to sell authentic period artifacts. Gallery attendants and curators sold the artworks as ready-to-wears at a bargain price. The spectacle of disarmed museum visitors caught up in a frenzy of nostalgic desire was accompanied by a floor projection of swing dancing feet, showing people how to use their new shoes. A swing dance lesson opened and closed the exhibition. The show featured 50-odd pairs of authentic 1920s to 1940s dance shoes, mostly dead stock from a long ago shuttered shoe shop, appropriated as sculptural forms. The collection was cobbled together to address a wide range of consumer needs, from fetish object, original artwork, vintage collectible, to museological artifact. Most of the shoes were unworn, though a select few were threadbare. Each had a story to tell. An audio guide narrated the backstories to each shoe in a period transatlantic accent. The lyrical biographies prompted reflection on the nostalgic spectacle, soliciting audience members in Baden-Baden to take a brief walk in the shoes of the imagined historical wearers. The launch, with a vintage dance class, was inspired by the contrast in how amateur dance communities in Britain and Germany reconcile their historical relationship to the jazz age. The victors reanimate and connect to the authenticity of the communal experience of the interwar and war years. The vanquished connect to an authenticity derived from collective guilt, either taking cultural responsibility or eschewing and denying culpability. It is still taboo to celebrate aesthetics of the 40s, even amongst the far right in Germany. In the UK, by contrast, a huge vintage living history and reenactment scene amplifies the collective nostalgia for the make do and mend, stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on culture, where the dance community gather, some in period regalia, at blitz parties. Costume and fashion enthusiasts fetishize the period, not only the dress, but also in a collective longing for a more real and authentic form of British culture. These vintage events reflect the present through a simulacrum of the past. By offering dance lessons and only providing women's shoes, the swing shoe shop highlighted biographies that were marginalized from nostalgic narratives on the dance floor in London. At dance events, there are frequently skewed gender demographics, while the binaries in the dance roles of lead and follow are still often equated to male and female. This anachronism in terms of role play was teased out, testing how our embodied participation plays out in a backlash of antiquated gender politics on the dance floor. The reenactment of African American jazz performance style in the Kunsthalle also invoked historical narratives deemed worthy of national pride for a self-critical German art audience, such as the anti-Nazi German youth movement of the Swing Kids. Meanwhile, the audio guide insinuated allegations of cultural appropriation and the whitewashing of the vernacular Harlem dance by white youth movements across Europe and America, first in the 1940s and again today. These cultural dislocations in the authentic embodiment of swing culture are relived and reinterpreted in the way contemporary vintage dress and swing dance movements are not representative of, nor often informed about, the African American cultural history of the dance and its styles. Visitors could try on the shoes while the curators turned shop assistants helped them squeeze on the miniature sizes with shoehorns and nylon sockies. Enthralled by the rush of the shopping sprees, sometimes damaging the shoes in the process, many treated the exhibit simply as a shoe shop. The shoes were uniformly under or overpriced, a bargain at 99 euros and 90 cents. Expensive for an old shoe, cheap for an artwork, often well under the auction value for a collector's item. The price bargains with the different forms of authenticity on sale: an emerging artist's early work, historical fashions to collect, vintage shoes to wear.
Here, the beadwork unravels like a bridge across satin and unfolds into a bed of sequins. Clashing with everything but the most bespoke gown It is the quintessential garnish. This elegant evening slipper makes a double allusion to the dress simmering with beads and the body saturated in music, both ready to spatter.
Something familiar to anyone who goes to a vintage dance event and sees an original 1920s dress dripping with beads all over the dance floor. It's really tricky to watch. Anyway, a video floor projection showed historical Charleston and Lindy Hop footwork from below, where indices of historical fashions are erased from silhouetted feet, yet these animated footwork diagrams and the gendered roles they perform produce a recognizable form of authenticity. Dress, by its very nature of display, must be embodied in a performative act. Fashions transform their wearers, but they are also always transformed by them in the moment of wearing. Uninhabited, limp textiles are empty vessels that require a particular kind of animation to achieve their identity. Swing Shoe Shop reinterprets the traces inscribed on dress objects and how unequivocally we seek to fill them with a pattern of our desires. In the museum, dress artifacts seem to have been abandoned by these animated bodies. They lose their performative authenticity when hung on dimly lit, inanimate mannequins. Curatorial solutions to the absence of bodies, from traditional murals that enliven the scene as backdrops to contemporary invisible mounts that highlight the ephemerality of the body, all share in the vacuum of this performative authenticity. Curators and conservators have found creative outlets for animating displays instead, from Loriot's mobile mannequins revolving around the gallery on conveyor belts to underscore Gautier's tongue-in-cheek trash aesthetic, or Reader and Coda's intricate architectonic constructions of Charles James through their analytical animations. Yet the fact remains that constraints of conservation prohibit artifacts' wear and the authenticity of the embodied experience. My practice-based PhD in art bypasses the constraints of conservation. The project fabricates an authentic collection of dress based on interwar pants patterns through the reinterpretation of historical methods and modes of dressmaking. An accompanying exhibition to the collection will allow these sartorial artifacts to envelop living bodies. Based on material studies of historical dressmaking practices and archival research on paper pattern, technologies, and drafting systems from World War I and World War II, it will retrace the fabrication of the original mode of wear through the lens of contemporary vintage culture. This cultivated inauthenticity refracts the nostalgic reimagining of the past in costuming subcultures, living history, and reenactment events, as well as museological dress displays. Based on my research at the Commercial Pattern Archive at URI with Professor Joy Emery, who sadly passed away this month, I have been developing an ontology of paper patterns. By studying the history of home sewing and developing my own practice as an amateur seamstress, I'm opening up pathways for multiple authenticities. Alongside the collection, I'm digitizing and distributing an online database of DIY digital patterns. In my online communities of practice, these vintage patterns still operate as a vibrant currency for sharing everyday fashions that were popular before the rise of ready-to-wear clothing. As media artifacts, these commercial patterns are undiminished in their use value. Despite their fragility as paper artifacts, they retain their essential qualities as a medium for design exchange across temporal and geographic boundaries. Using commercial sewing patterns as a medium authenticates the embodied fabrication methods, a topographic map to render the familiar sizes and shapes of the maker's body. Kidwell invokes how in tandem the innovations of the standard tape measure and paper pattern mark a fashion revolution in body perception. With the standardization, traditional cutting methods were inadequate to meet the demands of cutting a good figure. As such, one might say the standardized pattern eroded the authenticity of the body. As a new mass medium of exchange and cultural communication, the dress pattern was distributed as source code to the lifestyles depicted in women's illustrated journals in the 19th and 20th centuries. Taken in Walter Benjamin's use of the term, where authenticity describes the quality or aura of the original, the value of the vintage pattern as a unique collectible today is incongruous with its authentic historical use as a mass medium for reproduction. Patterns were disposable ephemera that allowed reproduction of a fleeting, fashionable style in popular culture. They were not conceived to be kept as unique artifacts. This paradoxical status still impacts their cultural value, even in the context of museum and archive collections. FIT just donated all of their patterns, their paper patterns, to COPA. Not relevant for the FIT collection. We appreciate them. In the Veblen-Simmel trickle-down theory of fashion, designers informed the mass popularity of styles to shape the cycle of everyday dress. When museums exhibit prominent designers, this positions them as virtuosic geniuses and haute couture as high art. Despite the increasing relevance of horizontal and populist theories of fashions, in the wake of social media platforms' dissemination of fashion through fashion subcultures, institutions still perpetuate models of high and low culture in their exhibitions of representative artifacts. This tendency retrenches traditional genre boundaries and reaffirms stubborn, uncritical status distinctions between the fine and applied arts. Showcasing everyday historical dress through its main mode of production, the vernacular creative practice of home sewing, revives the debate around the traditional exclusion of dress from aesthetic narratives through its dismissal as women's work. In the same way that reenactment events reinterpret historical realities with a grotesque inauthenticity, so do museums display a distorted representation of fashions. In their paper Hooked on Vintage, DeLong et al. Enumerate the vintage collector's discrimination between authentic and inauthentic to connote taste and knowledge status, but don't go further to interrogate the construction of taste itself. Despite approaches such as that of Fashion Unraveled, which I absolutely embrace, haute couture is still the dominant mode in museums. The history of everyday dress usually falls by the wayside, sartorial contributions of vernacular dress dismissed, as are the stories these artifacts might tell about their wearers. My inauthentic collection will ask how to display Western historical fashion, how displays of Western historical fashion would appear if they were representative of the dress cultures they appropriate. McRobbie's commodity feminism frames mainstream fashion as a copy without an original. There is no authentic, real me in the postmodern, post-feminist female subject. My work asks how a historical dress collection can authenticate a plurality of biographies and bodies at a time when the postmodern subject looks to the past to pattern their identity. Thank you very much.